What's the craziest thing you've ever seen with your own eyes happen in church? Stitch this video and let me know. I'll go first. One of my friends and her high school sweetheart dated for a little bit and then they had a baby together. After they graduated high school and a little bit more time had passed, they decided to get married. This is one of the first weddings that I remember going to with someone that I had grown up with, so it hit a little bit differently in our friend group. The bride was pregnant at the time, but she wasn't showing and nobody knew except the family. On what is supposed to be one of the happiest days of a bride and groom's life, the pastor decides to tell the congregation that the young lady is pregnant and the only reason that they're getting married is because she's having a child. She also tells her that she shouldn't be wearing a white wedding dress because both of her children were conceived out of wedlock, and then she makes the bride and groom apologize to their families in front of everyone for disgracing God. What's the craziest thing you've ever seen with your own eyes happen in church?
A knife, some meth, and a demonized man walked into my church. And no, this is not a joke. Last Sunday night, I was in church and I was teaching on angels and demons. A man came in the back and sat, and he was acting a little squirrely. Afterwards, I invited him up to the altar. He came up and he told me that voices had been talking to him and he had been seeing the things that I was talking about regularly. And he said he knew it was true, but the voices were asking him to do terrible things. He had his hands in his pocket and was facing me and pacing back and forth frantically. And then he would sit on the edge of the stage and take his hands out of his pocket and relax. He said, I didn't want to do what the voices are telling me to do. I just want to lay it down. I don't want to do it. And so I invited him to accept Jesus by first prophesying over him some things about his childhood that I couldn't have known. And weeping, he said, yes, I want the Jesus that just told you those things. And he accepted Jesus in his life. After he accepted Jesus through tears, he says, I'll lay it all down right now. I won't do what the voices are telling me to do. So I told him to lay it down. And he pulled out a knife and some meth and laid it at the altar. I got up, got down off the pulpit, and asked him if I could give him a hug. And when I did, I began to pray over him. And violently, demons started coming out of him. He tried to resist the hug, and then he leaned into the hug and wept. And then resist the hug and leaned into the hug and wept. And everyone around me saw what was happening. And pretty soon, every one of those demons left his body, and he slumped into a pile on my chest and fell to the floor and did not move again by the power of the Holy Spirit for 30 minutes. When he awoke, he was set free from addiction, saved, and delivered. The voices stopped. Don't worry, we got him into rehab. He's doing well, and he can't believe that the voices have finally stopped in his head. And he told us that he had a powerful encounter with the Lord, and everything that we said was exactly what he experienced. The power of God changed him, broke his addiction, set him free from the voices, and now he's a follower of Jesus. But this was the night that I almost got stabbed, but the power of God saved me that night. Don't be afraid of the demons. They need to be afraid of us. Oh yeah, this is a true story.
What's the craziest thing you've ever seen with your own eyes happen in church?
If I don't end up making a series on this, I probably will. There'll probably be multiple parts just because I grew up in a cult. So I've seen a lot of crazy things. Also, I would like to say that if you knew me personally, or you know me personally, or you grew up with me at that time of my life, and you don't feel like you had the same experience, just know that like your experience is still valid. But this is just my perception of what I lived through. Like I said, if you saw things differently, then that's your perception. You know, it's totally valid, but it doesn't invalidate what I went through and how I perceive things. And the more I talk to people about it, the more I feel like it was a cult. So, okay. So for some reason, my children decided to go ape shit after I recorded that. So that's why I'm recording it now, because I've dropped them off and I actually have time. So one of the craziest things that probably happened, well, not one of the craziest things, but it was just crazy in and of itself. Probably when I went into the 5th grade. Now keep in mind, this was a church and a school, so my parents worked at the church and the school, and I went to school there as well as church. By the time I got to the 5th grade, they changed a lot of things, so all the employees had to sign contracts on what they would and wouldn't do inside and outside of the church, and like their whole families, like what they would and wouldn't do. So like some of the things were like we weren't allowed to go to the movie theaters, which I got in so much trouble for, because as a teenager, like that was the hangout spot. We went to the movie theaters, and the movie theaters like connected to the mall, so like if you're walking into the movie theater, you're like walking into the mall, like they're kind of like the same. So I used to get caught all the time because people would be walking into the mall and see me and call my dad. Literally the dumbest thing ever. We weren't allowed to go to any restaurants that had the word bar in it, so like Applebee's Bar and Grill, couldn't go there. They didn't like for you to go to places that served alcohol at all, because, you know, God forbid you fall in the parking lot and someone think you're drunk. Girls, of course, had a very strict dress code. You couldn't be seen wearing pants, shorts, which once again, I always used to get in trouble for. Boys had no dress code, of course. You know, they had to, as long as they wore pants to church, they were fine to pretty much wear whatever outside of church. But girls, like, they weren't allowed to wear basketball shorts. Like, you had to wear dresses or skirts, and they couldn't be tight fitting. There's a lot more in the contract, so just like for
What's the craziest thing that you've ever seen with your own eyes happen in church?
I've been saying I'm gonna do one of these since the last round of these type of videos on around, but I guess I can go ahead and tell. So I'll start with saying I went to Missionary Baptist and I did AME Zion also, but the majority of it was Missionary Baptist. So my first time at the AME Zion church, I was flabbergasted, like I was really appalled, because the pastor was a black woman. And at I think my mama caught the Holy Ghost or something. 1 second. At Missionary Baptist Church, you will be lucky if they let the women who was powerhouse in the church call themselves a deaconess. Like, it was that bad. So when this lady spoke, she commanded so much attention to her. Like, everybody listened. It was no playing games with her. She spoke in tongues. Everybody got up. Like, people waving their hands, everybody catching the Holy Ghost, speaking tongues. They communicating in just tongues. So she come down from the pulpit. This motherfucker did not care where they landed. She walked somebody right on their forehead. Didn't care where they landed. Like, they was out, baby. Like, out, like you just gave them some NyQuil or something like. And that just mesmerized me. Now, this Missionary Baptist story. It was this one lady. She was the best singer in the church. She had a lot of power in the church. She was over children's church. I don't know why they gave her the responsibility of dealing with the children. I don't know why they did that to us. But she was one of the people that made being unlikable and unbearable her personality. Yeah. But she didn't play with me. She had one time to make a slick comment about how I came to church with my auntie and not my mama. So I asked her why her daughter didn't come to church, because I knew her daughter was having a teenage pregnancy. Next. I had to be like 9 or 10 at the time, and the little girl in this story was younger than me, so she had to be like 5 or 6. And her dad had unalived himself. Somebody asked the little girl how she was doing, and they was talking to her. Everybody was just, giving her support. Why this lady come out the boondocks talking about some, oh yeah, your daddy in hell? Like, and she didn't say it one time. She didn't even said a second time to clear up any confusion. She said it at least 3 times that day, and she said it on multiple other occasions, just to tell the little girl that her daddy was in hell because he killed himself.
What's the craziest thing you've ever seen with your own eyes happen in church?
It was time to collect the offering in the church. Normal service, everybody grabbed their money, went to the front, dropped it, and went back to their seats. But instead of the worship continuing, the pastor stands up and goes to the altar. He grabs a mic and he says, "Who here needs to pay rent?" A man raised his hand and he went to the front. And then the pastor proceeds to give him all the money in the basket. It didn't stop there though. He said, if it's more than what you need, go ahead and get yourself some groceries. But if it's not enough, come see me afterwards. That was one of the biggest Jesus moments I've ever seen. And it sucks that most of these stitches are going to be negative experiences. Rightfully so. As a musician, I've seen my fair share of things in the church. But I also want to shed light on the good things. Because the last thing I want to do is to encourage you to leave the church. I want to motivate you to make church better. So if you want to hear more of these stories, follow me. Let's be friends.
Okay, y'all. So I not only seen it, I experienced it, right? So one day my mom decided that I was gonna go to Sunday school. Mind you, we're religious, but we don't go to church every Sunday. So I'm in Sunday school, we chilling. We had Eki and Sophus for breakfast. It was lit, right? Now we get into a prayer circle. It's all kids holding hands. We're supposed to do a prayer. And so our grown-up people, like black people, just like dancing in church, shaking, doing all of that, because they feel the spirit of the Lord. And so this one kid, he was actually very tall, right? We was all holding hands. He started shaking. And I'm like, all right, he's really feeling the spirit of the Lord. And I'm like, yes. And so I continued to hold his hand. But the spirit of the Lord caused him to fall on the ground. Like, he was on the ground shaking. Whole time thinking he feeling the spirit of the Lord. He was having a whole seizure. Like, I was that innocent. Like, I was not aware of different diseases. And so, yeah, he was having a seizure. That was kind of crazy. I really thought it was, he was catching the spirit.
What's the craziest thing you've seen with your own eyes at church?
Ooh, I have a story for you guys. And let me preface this by saying I do not come from a Christian-based family, but I did attend a lot of different Christian churches growing up because I grew up in North Carolina and my family is very free-spirited and open-minded. Nevertheless, I was not used to the extreme behavior that some fanatical Christians express. So when I was 17 and I went to this women's Christian empowerment retreat with my boyfriend at the time's mom, it literally traumatized me. It was honestly fine for the first couple days. It wasn't until the last service of the weekend that shit got weird. So the women were encouraged to bring their families to this last sermon. So the room was packed of men, women, and children. And this is one of those like shopping center churches. You know what I'm saying? So not the most sophisticated operation, not that big. AC's not flowing that great. So overall, physically pretty uncomfortable. And again, it was packed to the brim. So the pastor is doing this last sermon about the whole concept of how you don't just pray for what you want, you have to work in tandem with God. And so the way that they worded that was like, you have to birth your blessing. It's laborious, it's intensive, you got to put in the work. Cool, pretty inspirational. So we're in there, he's saying the sermon, it's getting a little rowdy, people are shouting, people are running around, people are passing out, nothing I haven't seen before. One thing I've never fucking seen before is a woman get on the ground and get into birthing position. I don't know who told this woman to do that. I don't know if it was planned, but she gets on the ground at the altar and opens her legs in a seated position and starts to push as if she is going into labor. She's holding her belly and everything. I'm looking around at everyone else's reactions like, okay, like she's really into this theme. Like, what the fuck is her deal? And everyone else is into it. I really think it might have been planned because then the pastor kneels before her. One of the staff members puts a blanket over her legs and he's reaching under the blanket between her legs and is yelling at this woman to push. Y'all don't understand. He is yelling at the top of his lungs like it is a life or death situation for this woman to push. And everyone starts yelling at her. You have to birth your blessing. It's a labor. You gotta push it. What do you want? You want that house? You want that new man? You want that promotion? You gotta push. And so before I know it, there are several women on the ground screaming, pushing, and there's people getting on the ground, kneeling and shoving their hands under the blankets to simulate childbirth. So I just sat there and avoided eye contact with everyone because that is not something I wanted to participate in. Like, if that's what it's going to take for me to get a blessing, I don't want shit. Crazy.
What's the craziest thing you've ever seen with your own eyes happen in church? Stitch this video and let me.
So, craziest thing I've ever seen, and my mom is on here so she can attest to this. It was about 2008, 2009, I want to say. And one of our members, she was a new member. She wasn't new, but she was new. Like, she had only been there for a few years. She was about my mom's age, maybe older, I don't know. And she was light-skinned, about 5'3". And she came to church the Sunday, and I don't want to say the left or the right side of her face was just slumped. Just one side. The other face was fine. Just one side of her face was slumped. And she had had a stroke on one side of her face. And close to the end of the service, my pastor, Pastor Moore, told us to reach out our hands and pray for her and give her our energy. And he put alcohol on her forehead and just prayed, put his hand over her face and prayed on this side of her face. And seeing that in person with my own two eyes, and we had cameras, so cause we sold the services and even put it on TV, and seeing that on camera, cause we had a projection board, so we can watch the service or whatever, or people who are too far behind, in the back can watch the service, and they put the camera on her face before. While Pastor Moore just hovering above her face, praying for her. I want to say we prayed for about 15 minutes. Right when when Pastor Moore moved his hand, her face was back to normal. And that let me believe, that made me believe in miracles. That showed me, that made me believe in God and how powerful He is. That it was, like I said, 10-15 minutes. Just giving Pastor Moore our energy to pray over her and fix her face, and literally, her face was fine. She blinked because she could barely blink with her bad eyes. She blinked and it was all good. It's crazy.
What's the craziest thing you've ever seen with your own eyes happen in church?
Boy, I got a good one for y'all. Y'all need to listen to this. So I was about 9 or 10 at the time, and me, my family, and the pastor was just trying to find a home church. So we finally came across one here in Charlotte, and at first it was going good. The pastor at that church at the time made my current pastor a deacon, so everything was cool. Then when months go by, the pastor at that church was kind of starting to not like my current pastor right now, I guess because the congregation liked him more and enjoyed him a lot more when he was preaching other than that pastor. So one day I walked in, I could just tell the pastor was off. He wasn't feeling it that day, I guess. My current pastor got up on the pulpit, started preaching. Next thing I know, that pastor stood up, got in front of him, and pulled out a handgun and pointed at his head. Everybody in this church just started screaming and praying and everything, running around and everything. And the only thing you hear from the pastor is click, click, click. Not one bullet came out. We all know who held them bullets back. Jesus! Then the pastor was on the ground because, he had to. My current pastor had to put the paws on him. Cops showed up, took the gun, looked at it, and it was fully loaded. And like I said, not one bullet came out. He went to a mental hospital and stayed there until the day he died, actually. And my pastor was there all the time by his bedside, just praying for him and just acting like that didn't even happen. That's a God-fearing man, I'm telling you.
What's the craziest thing you've seen at church?
At my old church on Halloween, we did this reenactment where we burnt my dad at the stake as a martyr. So I grew up in a tiny independent Baptist church in the South, and there was a lot of batshit crazy stuff that was preached from the pulpit. But the craziest thing I ever saw was on Halloween. And of course, we didn't celebrate Halloween, so we celebrated Reformation Day. Reformation Day is basically the anniversary of when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the wall of a Catholic church, sort of separating Protestants from Catholics. So at Halloween, everyone would dress up in like Renaissance type clothing and meet at the church, and we would have like a big potluck and have games, and every year we would do a skit. So this year, the skit was about a Protestant who like stood up to the Catholic Church and the monarchy. And I was playing the queen. I don't really remember all the details, but basically I was the queen that sentenced this man to be put to death. He was like burned at the stake. And and my dad played the man that was the martyr being burned at the stake. So basically, I spent Halloween burning my dad at the stake.
Big dog status, I'm a big